Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Pascal Alate. I am the director with the United Nations University International Institute for Global Health and one of the co-chairs of the Lancet Commission on Gender and Global Health. My co-chairs are Professor Sarah Hawkes and Dr. Asi El Haji. Now, the Lancet Commission on Gender and Health has been set up with the explicit and uncompromising aim to move beyond the evidence to catalyze action. For change to happen, academic evidence is necessary, but insufficient. The world does not need another report on the evidence and extent of a so-called gender problem in health. The Commission was born of a collective and strategic understanding of the need to mobilize individuals and institutions to redress imbalances in the gender health relationship, producing a politically informed, globally relevant, and intersectional feminist strategy for structural change in global health. The webinar series provides an opportunity for our commissioners to share some of their ideas and to engage with other commissioners and with all of you as a mechanism for public engagement as we develop the priorities, evidence, and structure of the Commission report. Welcome all of you, and we hope you can engage with this report and with previous ones that are also available on YouTube. I'm delighted this afternoon to introduce Associate Professor Ben Cislaghi, who is with the Department of Global Health and Development in the Center for Gender, Health and Violence at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Ben's areas cover ethics, gender equality, and violence. Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Pascal. So let me start and share my screen, hopefully painlessly. Okay. So this presentation is titled Helping Women Live Meaningful Lives. It should have really been titled 3 Poisons in Gender Equality, but we will get to it. But I'd like to start with just one second with something that has little to do with the presentation itself, but just a reminder. I took this picture, just a reminder of how right now our way of life is impacting on indigenous ways of life, nomadic populations. I'm thinking about my Maori friends in New Zealand and many other indigenous populations that are being subjugated by a post-colonial cancerous spreading way of life that is being imposed through neoliberal mechanisms. So I'd like to just dedicate a few seconds of silence for me to be mindful of what we are creating with this global order. Okay, so I guess I'll start by, I am someone who's interested in ethics. Ethics has got a lot to do with history, but also with spirituality, with different ways of looking at the world. And it's very interesting to me to look back at the history of humanity and notice how the energy of the feminine has been cherished and elevated throughout history, especially in indigenous communities. Something that not many people might know, for instance, is that the highest mountain on earth is called Chomolungma by the Tibetan, and it literally means goddess mother of the world. Then the British named it after a man, George Everest, who was the man to discover it. And by the way, the Nepali name for it is Sagarmatha, which means goddess of the sky. So it's very interesting to me that despite this huge attention and knowledge and awareness of the feminine energy, today we've kind of really lost the meaning of energy, and we have assigned the feminine energy as a very tight container to women and the masculine energy as a very tight contained to men. This is Ardhanarishvara. Ardhanarishvara is literally signifies the totality that lies beyond duality. Is a composite form of the Hindu deities Shiva and Parvati. Parvati being also known as Devi and Shakti. The meaning behind the Ardhanarishvara is really that Ardhanarishvara is half male and half females, equally split in the middle, but really illustrates how feminine and masculine are energies that combine and go beyond duality in every being, so that when those energies are in harmony, not necessarily in balance, but in harmony, then energy is created. And the recognition that there is feminine energy in any person, in any of us, and there is masculine energy in any of us, really goes beyond the duality of gender. And I think that's something that we have kind of forgotten in the existing discourse on, or the existing way of life that we embody, particularly in the global north. So we are, and of course, when energy is, when this energy is stale or moving, then we result in the many inequalities that we experience, right? And I'll get to, I'll bring back Ardhanarishvara towards the end of this presentation. So of course, most people in the audience will probably be very familiar with this. The pay gap, particularly noticeable in underdeveloped countries like Switzerland, Denmark, France, Norway, and instead less prevalent in developed countries or wise countries like Colombia, Vietnam, and the like. And of course, land ownership being very much skewed towards men owning land, inequalities in formal education, which goes both way. Actually, 56% in, this is a paper by Lao Guo and Feng Shu, who look at a reverse gap in adolescents, but again, material inequalities in formal education and material inequalities in health. So this is kind of a framework. I might be going a little bit fast because I'm very excited to show you what's next. But I guess this is a framework that really helped me to realize that some inequalities are material in the global discourse on gender inequality, and some of these are, as I mentioned, salary gap, land ownership, access to formal education, and health. And of course, some of these inequalities are biological, but most of these are gender related. Like, for instance, trachoma, which is an infection of the eye that is passed on by children. Women are more exposed to it because they're caregivers, traditionally assume roles of caregivers. And some of these inequalities are normative, and I call these normative oppressions. So this kind of duality framework, the material and the normative. And this is Agnodike. Agnodike is a great story of a powerful woman who in ancient Greece was discouraged from practicing medicine, and yet she became the first female physician, and she had to dress as a man to be able to practice. And then when she was found out, all the women, she was initially sent away, said, you can't practice anymore, but all the women that she helped revolted and got her accepted so that she could actually practice. So that's to me the kind of normative oppression, right? There was no really material reason for her not to practice. But and then again, this is a quote by Bell Hooks, who wrote, the first act of violence the patriarchy demands of males is that they engage in acts of physical self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves. If a man is not successful in emotionally crippling himself, he can count on patriarchal men to enact rituals of power that will assault his self-esteem. So, so really moving into this unbalanced energy space, we observe these material inequalities and also these normative oppressions. And then what I was interested in today is to look at the causes of these normative and oppressions and material inequalities. And of course, this is the cover of a book by Paul Bond, The Looting of Africa. Of course, most of these oppressions and inequalities, and as many of us have said way before me, are to be found in a global order that is deeply, deeply violent, and in which some people have a different access to resources and have higher power, right? And very often this is looked at as, so material inequalities and normative oppressions are looked at as being a tightly linked or result of patriarchy, meaning patriarchy is a social structure distributing power and resources unevenly. and obviously goes without saying, associating with whatever is identified as male or masculine, a higher social, place in the social hierarchy and greater access to power and resources. I would add to those hyper-capitalism, industrialization, hyper-intellectualism, so the loss of connection with the body, the commodification of relationship, the humanization of interactions so that they become transactions. Yet I would assume that the iceberg diagram, the iceberg model that I'm presenting here is actually deeply inadequate to understand the deep causes of gender inequality. So while gender inequality is definitely rooted in patriarchy, I want to suggest that there's actually something deeper than patriarchy that is sustaining gender equality. And that if we don't address that deeper cause, then we risk creating a new gender order, hopefully. Well, not hopefully, but if we ever manage to create a new gender order or a new social system that could be as toxic and harmful as patriarchy. So in other way, I don't think that the metaphor of the iceberg is a good one, but the metaphor of the volcanoes is much better. So in a way, the smoke is all that we see out of this inequal system, and this is the gender pay gap, these are the material oppressions, these are the normative oppressions. Then we observe the volcano, which is the way this stuff comes out from, which is patriarchy, hyper-capitalism, hyper-modernization. But I'm kind of interested in the magma. What is at the core of the problem? And so I am a Buddhist practitioner. I'm not a guru, I'm not a Buddhist scholar, but something that really stuck with me is that in Buddhism, something that the Buddha suggested to be the cause of much suffering in the world are three poisons. And these three poisons are greed, ignorance, and hatred. So greed is represented traditionally in Tibetan Buddhism by the rooster. And this is the desire to acquire, to accumulate, is in a way what is linked to primitive accumulation, right? It was what generates physical attachment, is the desire to have possessions. Its antidote is gratitude. And then we have hatred, which is symbolized by the snake. The snake is emotional attachment, right? It's the desire to own relationship, to control relationships. So power, control, manipulation is what generates emotional attachment, as I mentioned. And then the third poison is ignorance, represented by the pig. And what generates this is the desire to be. It's very interesting to me how this is linked to identity, either individual identity and collective identity, because identity separates, generates boundaries between me and the other, so that then I become detached from you, and this generates labels such as the savior, the victim, the persecutor, and its antidote is humility. I won't go into arrogance right now, but we can go back to it. So I want to now see, how is patriarchy, if we were to give a perspective using these three poisons to patriarchy, what would we understand? And this is just a thought, right? It's the beginning of a conversation. So in a way, then greed makes me think about accumulation of power. So how men get attached to the desire to control political decision making, or the control of women's reproductive functions. I personally believe, and I probably will expose myself, but I'm still making my mind on whether monogamy is actually a patriarchal construction that aims at controlling the means of reproduction of the social order. Then accumulation of resources, and the gender pay gap is an example of that, right? So greed doesn't allow to let go. And accumulation of successes, managerial positions in major company. Then what about hatred? Well, control over women's behavior. So we got what's generally called domestic violence, intimate partner violence. And manipulation of dominant narratives, the distortion of evidence, right? When and we see today when I would say anti-feminist intellectuals manipulate the evidence to gaslight the global collective into believing that actually women are not experiencing the material presence that I mentioned before. And then you have the third poison, which is ignorance, the essentialization of women's roles, right? So as a woman, you are a caregiver, could say a man, which is really not understanding, is the ignorance of realizing that the woman is the woman in front of him is an actual human being. So this creates the normative oppressions and also ignorance of women's desire. So this is what has been. This is what Meia Sua, among others, the French anthropologist, speaks about. Is the lack of communication in relationships. So again, the adverization, the commodification of the other. Now, despite the fact that I just used the 3 poisons as a way of showing how, in a way, they're fueling patriarchy, and so patriarchy is just a manifestation of the 3 poisons, I want to be mindful of the fact that the 3 poisons are actually there in every human being as a potential distortion of life. And I really I was reading this piece by Brown that I recommend, and she wrote, as we move towards the end of patriarchy and beginning of something new, we have to recognize how the masculine we have a problem with is a distorted and toxic version of what is in reality a fundamental quality of the universe. Again, the masculine energy, if you recall Ardhanarishvara, the masculine energy is detached from this manifestation of the masculine. Otherwise, there is the risk of making men the villains, missing the chance to activate a potent aspect of self and become whole. And this is the 3rd point that I'm really interested in, recreating new communities with the same toxic dynamic at their core. And this is really where I want now to direct our attention. I want to look at how the 3 poisons of Buddhism, the 3 poisons that the Buddha has brought as a cause of suffering in the world, really can filter through the work that we're doing to actually subvert the patriarchal order, and how the risk is that we create a new order with the same toxic relationships and environment. And I will start by greed, the first poison. So in a way, I see in international development an attention to desire and control outcomes. Think about, for instance, the family planning community. Very often, the big debate that comes over and over and again is who decides which outcomes, which fertility outcomes should a given woman achieve, or what should be the fertility rate of any given woman. And that debate is still well alive, right? Despite the London summit, despite the Cairo conference, still today, we observe a desire to create interventions that aim to achieve a certain rate of use of modern family planning methods across populations that are actually not even in the country where those interventions are designed. So this cross-cultural manipulation or desire, well-intentioned, by the way, but in a way with a push to an unaware, unwitting push towards controlling the final outcome instead of staying with the process. And this is like, we are all familiar with the ways in which we have to design gender transformative interventions that very often need to have all this very hyper-intellectualized log frame in which we commit to achieving certain outcomes. But in achieving those outcomes, we're actually, I contend, possibly not caring about women, but caring about outcomes. And the difference is massive. And until we instead let go of the greed towards the outcome and we can stay with the process and listen to women and to their desires, then we're not going to achieve, I believe, real change in real gender transformative change. And this is a piece by Lao Tzu that I really like. He wrote in the Tao Te Ching. It's a long piece, but it says, the more laws and restrictions there are, the poorer people become, the sharper men's weapons, the more trouble in the land. And my colleague Caroline Stevens showed me this. And then he wrote, I take no action and people are reformed. I enjoy peace and people become honest. I do nothing and people become rich. I have no desires and people return to the good and simple life. So an idea that over control of a process can result in actually the opposites of what is desire. And this is, my colleague John Porter told me the word ma as an ideogram in Japanese, which really has the symbols of the gate and the sun coming through the gate. And I feel that we're not creating enough space for women to actually come up with their voice. We're over controlling and crowding the space of gender transformative interventions in a way in which possibly, not all the time, but possibly, the risk is that the oppression that women were experiencing in their localities is just substituted by the oppression of the intervention, instead of creating that space in the gate through which women, as the sun, can come through the gate and create space in their life to achieve lives that are meaningful to them. Moving a little bit quicker, the second is ignorance, right? And I think that we need accurate data. We're not collecting accurate data to collect and understand women's desires. We assume women's needs, but we're not quite equipped to understand what women deeply want and desire. And the unmet needs is a challenge, is in itself a challenging measure. And then, of course, there is the problem of false consciousness. I put the little mouse saying support the fat cat. But how do we engage with the problem of false consciousness without accurate data is an issue. So the problem of false consciousness, for those of you who are listening to this presentation and are not quite familiar with it, is how do we engage with a woman who seems to want to have, to desire a life that is actually quite in contrast, that is quite framed in a very patriarchal way, and it might be difficult for us to understand as outsiders, and we might say, well, this woman wants this life because she's being socialized into a very patriarchal understanding of herself. But then I don't think that we are equipped with a conceptual framework that allows us to engage with women in a way in which they can also tell us, you know, I've heard you, I've listened to you, but I really want what I want, and I know it might be difficult for you to understand. The second point of ignorance is that we have an unresolved tension between opportunities and outcomes, right? Of course, we want equality of opportunity, but we are measuring through equality of outcome. And I'm not going to go into this right now, but this really calls for a deep reflection on the value that we assign to agency and how do we understand agency. And agency in itself is an unresolved problem, because then who judges whether a woman has agency or not? And what does having agency means when a woman makes choices that seem not rational to an outsider? And then the third problem, I think, is that we don't quite know what is gender equality. We know what is not gender equality, but we don't have a consensus, a shared global consensus of what is gender equality. And when we look at the indices that we have for gender, well, this is the gender inequality index, quite interestingly. And of course, there are many indices of gender equality. But some of the stuff that I get a bit worried about is that we're using measures that in a way tend to replicate the global social order and system, the global social and political order. So, for instance, labor force participation, or it's something that I still wrestle with, because I do not believe that a society in which everyone works full time is actually a desirable society. I think that's the hyper-capitalism historical moment in which we're living is biasing us towards the belief that working full-time is a good thing. And I don't think it is. And of course, we're talking about equality in labor force participation here, but it's just, so it's not necessarily everyone working full-time, it might be working part-time, which begs the question, however, of how couple makes decision of labor distribution within the family. So again, I think this is the second poison, is that we are ignorant about a shared and consensual understanding of what a gender equal world deeply looks like. And moving on to my third and last poison, which is hatred. I think that the problem of hatred goes down to essentialization. And this is a painting that is often used in conjunction with Said's orientalization. So the desire to label each other. And I think this is really dangerous, and is very easy. You know, I was talking to my students of ethics last week exactly about this. It's very easy to label each other as being, oh, this is my friend who's perfect, this is my friend who's evil, so or my enemy who's evil. Everything that comes from this side will be bad, everything that comes from this side will be good. So then we start labeling each other, or labeling even third parties into the powerful and the powerless. the oppressors and the oppressed, the perpetrators and the victims. And a great learning comes from the work of Paulo Freire on this, who asked this very deeply question of, well, who said, first of all, actually, you won't believe it if you are in the oppressed group, but oppression actually harms the oppressors as well. And real true liberation is sought by both the oppressed and the oppressors, because that liberates the oppressors as well. And the risk with essentialization is also conceptual tribalism, right? And we see this in the academia and tribal activism, so that we create fights between for the control of resources and power between different groups of activism, so activist groups. So that generates this fantastic painting comic by Tom Gold. So moving a little bit quicker, because I want to be done in the next 4 minutes. So I think much of the problem comes also from our idea of self. And again, the Western idea of self, I think, is deeply flawed. Is this idea of self, and I owe this to my very, very good friend and sister, spiritual sister, Catherine Loves, who's a Maori academic from New Zealand. And she taught me that she really made me see this. The Western paradigm of the self is the self as being a container, right? So look at the language that we use. Oh, I'm broken, I'm in pieces, I feel in pieces, I need to put myself together. So if each of us is a container, then we end up being very reactive and protective, right? And then we end up being scared about the others, because we can smash the one against the other and break. But here's an idea of the self as Catherine taught it to me. As being a system of semi-permeating membranes in which nature, ancestors, the spirit, the family, and the community, they hold each other together. So in this idea of self, then, I can let go of these poisons, right, that will make me come against you because I am the solution and you're the problem. And instead, it's an idea of self as being held in place by what came before me, and the connection with nature, and the connection with family and community, so that instead of being a space of rights, it becomes a space of responsibilities. My responsibility to help you is your responsibility to help me. And this resonates a lot with the idea of self in Patanjali's paradigm, which was explained to me by Mahesh Mathpati, who's a colleague at the LSHTM and an Ayurvedic doctor. An idea of self that goes beyond the spirit or the physical and the mental, and goes to the social and the environmental, so that there is no self without the other. In this connection with the other, then gender transformative work becomes a space of care and a space of reappropriation of that energy that really composes the masculine and the feminine in a way in which we can come together and find solutions that are not solutions of oppressions, but a solution of conciliatory mutual liberation. And this is my last 3 slides. One point that often comes to me is appreciating how the last 2,000 years have given us a huge technological progress. And I know that some have argued that actually things are going much better. And it's true, life expectancy, even though we're not so sure, to be honest, but life expectancy appears to have increased, at least in the last 50 years. I don't know what happened in the last 10,000, but it's safe to assume that probably it increased. Yet when I walk on the underground and everyone is looking at their phones and I'm barely seen, well, I'm not walking on the underground anymore since the pandemic, but then I wonder, is technology actually reducing suffering? And while we had a huge technological progress, I'm not so sure that we had the great spiritual progress. And it seems that the same problems are the problems that existed at the time of the great spiritual leaders, among which I really appreciate Olga Kudryna and Mai Menina Dugantovic, which are 2 fantastic female spiritual leaders that I really appreciate. So then, what is the solution? Here's 3 questions that I would like to wrestle with in my time going forward. Greed. Is gender equality in a capitalist global, hyper-capitalist global system even possible? Or is hyper-capitalism so much influencing our vision of gender equality that then what we're trying to achieve is essentially impossible, because we are trying to achieve equality in a system of exploitation that doesn't really create any space for equality. And then ignorance. Is our vision of gender equality based by the life lived by us? And by us, I mean the powerful of the world, the intellectuals of the world, the ones that have the privileged of the world. And then if it is, how do we actually allow for new visions of gender equality to come and challenge us? And of course, I know that there is a huge movement of non-Western feminism. And I wonder what is the space that we allow to that movement in serious conversations about creating indices and global policies. And then hate, and this is to me one of the most challenging. Can the oppressed be compassionate towards the oppressors? And I understand that it's very difficult. I was talking to one of my students who has seen horrible things, and it's very difficult to forgive when you have seen people killing your members of your family, or where you have experienced oppression yourself, and then all of a sudden you say, you know, bloody hell, why is it my role now to be compassionate towards someone who oppressed me? And I wonder whether we do need a spiritual awakening in that regard. Otherwise, we're just going to kind of flip, if anything. But then the push to flip the order is just another push that is moved by poisoners and not solutions. So, in conclusion, this is my last slide. Thank you for bearing with me throughout this long rambling. But in conclusion, I really hope that we can regather our feminine and masculine energies in ways that generate all the wonderful spectrum of genders that exist out there, but in a way which can create space of compassion and responsibilities, and moving away from a poisonous space in which we are becoming more atoms, in the hope that we can create a truly transformative gender equality world. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that. I have to say, one of the things that I find, it's incredibly thought-provoking, and I really love, as we've gone through the various other webinars as well, how we're beginning to see similar threads coming through, and how we might address this in the report. But let me go straight away to questions. We've got a question here from Kathy. So what is your theory of change for turning ideas of this nature into political action for structural change?
Thank you. That's not an easy question to answer, but I don't know. I think we need a process that allows political action to generate spiritual compassion, to generate values. I think that we have completely forgotten the importance of political action in fostering moral awakening. And I think if anything, political action and the huge democracies that we're witnessing today are, if anything, giving us are manifesting the poison themselves. Look at the divisions, the nationalisms. I mean, don't even get me started with the previous American presidency. But and just to mention one of the many problematic leaders that we have in the world right now. So I think we need a spiritual awakening in which we can actually create political action that becomes evidence of mutual compassion and care. And I am happy to have a 5-day discussion on how that can.
I wish we were able to do that. We have some compliments through the YouTube channel. Just a reminder to everybody who's watching us through YouTube that these webinars are available for viewing at your own time. So if your colleagues weren't able to join, or if you want to watch them again, they are available through a link that Emma will put into YouTube shortly. And we hope we will see you again. We will send out information on the next webinar that we have. And so for now, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next webinar as well. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.